Okay, first I want to talk about the difference between submission and obedience, because submission reveals your attitude. Okay, one of the things that I did with my children growing up is if I told my children to do something and they did it and rolled their eyes, I would spank them anyway. Because, see, it's not good just enough to obey. You have to submit to my authority. And see, this is what people do to God, is they submit to God but rebel doing it. I did it in preaching. So, I learned this the hard way. So you could say it this way: your submission reveals your attitude, while your obedience reveals your conduct. So obedience is a matter of conduct. Submission is a matter of attitude. I can obey you with a bad attitude. If I do, I'm still wrong. And see, this is why when we come into the church, we can see what's happening in the church today is that nobody wants to submit to the authority, and rightfully so of most pastors, because they're not really representing the authority of God. They're representing the authority of themselves or the organization or what. I wouldn't submit to that either. But if you find a man who's submitting to the authority of God, you can submit to him, because his authority will bring you up to a higher level. So in Acts 4:19, now it makes sense why that they told the council that it's better to obey God than man, because it says, "But Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than God, judge ye." So they're letting them know, that our obedience and submission is to a higher authority. And this is why when we read the scriptures, sometimes we get confused, because we find stories in the Bible where the midwives with Moses disobeyed the king, but yet Moses lived and become part, is because we're thinking, well, they disobeyed authority. Well, no, they submitted, but they obeyed. And it gets tricky. I don't have time to get into that. But this is exactly, when God's establishing authority, just always remember your obedience will reveal your conduct, okay? But your submission is in your attitude. And right now we're watching children have an attitude of rebellion, so they won't submit to authority. That's why the schools are a mess. That's why the police departments are having problems. That's why kids, even in church, we're having children. Teachers are coming to me saying, the kids they're having trouble submitting because they have a rebellious attitude in their hearts. And we have to pray over these kids, and we have to learn these kids that, they have to get the submission down, because if they don't, they're going to limit themselves as to how much God can bless them and use them with truths, okay? So like I said, there's stories in the Bible like the midwives that disobeyed Pharaoh. There's Daniel, who seemed to go against the king. Even Joseph, all these stories, if you read them, you begin to think, well, these guys were, but see, God was establishing his authority because their submission was to him. So, and you're not afraid to stand, because when it comes a time somebody tells you to do something against God or God's authority, you have to stand for that higher authority, without question. But what about when authority becomes questioned? Who's in authority? So this is the session I want to end with, is because I want to talk about the story of when in the 12 tribes of Israel each had a representative of each tribe. But now it was time for somebody. They were trying to establish order and priesthood, and everybody wanted to be the priest. Say they wanted to be the high priest. So it would be like with us if we had no pastor and we all come together and we say, well, how do we elect a pastor? Well, first of all, the word elect is wrong, because only voting in the Bible is when they chose the replacement for Judas, and he's never mentioned again. Paul was appointed to replace that position by God's authority. So that's why churches that vote are never going to find submission to God, because they've taken the submission on themselves of their own power. And see, this is what God had to show this to Israel. Here's a principle I don't want you to miss. And this is why it's so dangerous what I'm talking about, because men who abuse authority are dangerous men. And this is the whole problem with Trump retaking office, makes people nervous, is because they are afraid he'll misuse the authority of the office. And you don't want to get into politics, but so here's what he does. They come and they're questioning who's going to be the high priest. So what does God tell them to do? Everybody know the story? He said, let each priest bring their rod and bring it into the tent of meetings and bring it before me. So everybody had a rod. Evidently, every rod had a symbol of the tribe or their name on it. I don't know, but what is a rod? A rod, first of all, is made out of wood, and it's a wood that has been cut off from the source. Okay, so like just for us, it would be a cane. Picture somebody walks in with a cane, and that cane is a piece of wood, and it's been cut for many years, and it's no longer connected to the source that made it a piece of wood. So now it has a different purpose, and it's to be a rod. So they bring the rods, and obviously they know whose rods are whose. Now, I don't know, it doesn't say, I'm sure they had their names on them, or they had the sign of their tribe or whatever. So there was no question as whose rod was who. That wasn't the question. The question was who is going to be an authority, who's going to be the high priest, rather, that will be over the other priests. And see, this is where men are missing it today, is because we are doing the who's who by who you are. And this bothers me. This is why you'll never see me. I don't never run to big conferences, and I don't never buy into the big names of preachers. Not saying they're wrong, not saying that. I went to some of Benny Hinn's services early in his ministry, but Benny Hinn failed. He was a man. Isn't it amazing why everybody that rises to the top usually ends up falling? I could just name you name after name in my lifetime, Jimmy Swaggart, in the most recent, T.D. Jakes. All these guys rise to the top and they fall. Why do they fall? It's because they begin to lose track of what they are is a rod. See, they think the rod carries the authority. The only thing that separates the rod from other rods is the resurrection power. Now, I'm going to explain it to you, but see, here's the thing. Like when Jesus, can you imagine Jesus when he was riding into Jerusalem and he's riding this donkey and they're throwing out the palm leaves and they're crying, Hosea? Can you imagine if the donkey looked back and said, is this for me or you? Now, let me tell you something. If you're a servant of God, you're a donkey. And you start taking the glory to yourself, you're looking back at him and said, I'll take this one. And what happens is he'll put you back without the source to being a dead rod. Now, here's what's going to here's what they did. Every man's rod had to be equal. It was equally dead, it was equally lifeless, it was equally no fruit, and equally no budding. So isn't it amazing that all 12 men, how can you boast in your rod just because you carved something prettier on yours than I did? Or you have a fancier rod than I do? It's still a dead, lifeless rod. So it doesn't matter when you come to God in your arrogance and your talent and your knowledge, you're still a dead rod. Ain't nobody interested. I mean, it shouldn't be, but that draws people today. I don't understand it, man. You can have a guy anointed, full of wisdom, teaching truth. Nobody wants to hear him, but if he's got some elegant trick, they'll flock in by the thousands to see him. It's because we don't understand what's behind the rod. So we're about to see a story here that where God separates who's going to be in authority by the life that's in them. And it's humbling. This is going to be humbling because, what was the thing that God did? So every man's rod was the same. Every man's rod was dead. No man's rod had fruit. No man's rod had leaves. It was identified to him, but it's still a dead, lifeless rod. Now, can you imagine when they brought these rods, they probably thought, well, how's this going to work? Nobody explained to them what was about to happen. So they bring the rods to the tent of meeting. Every man lays his rod. There's 12 of them. And so the next day, there'll be no question as to whose rod's different, but did they really know what was about to happen? So the next day, when they come to get the rods, Aaron's rod, what? Spring forth leaves, budded, and had almonds on it. Now, I don't know, see me, the way I do things when I study the scripture, immediately what I wanted to know is what is an almond. Because, people will tell you that an almond is a nut. It's not. An almond is a seed. So God sprouted seed. Almond's not a nut. They sell them as nuts, but if you look it up, it's not a nut. It's a seed. So what they did was they came out and they pass out the rods and they go, every rod was the same. Every rod was dead. Every rod was represented. But now one rod is alive. So the thing that showed the difference between the authority and non-authority was who rod got resurrected without the connection of the earth. See, there's people trying to resurrect themselves. Let me give you my card, brother. I'll come and preach for you. Let me give you a tape. I'm not asking anybody to go anywhere and preach. If God raises me up, that's fine. If I stay right here in Galion, I'm fine with that too. I've taught on a Wednesday night when it was one person in the congregation, and the only prayer I had at the beginning was, I pray they don't have to go to the bathroom while I'm teaching. But now, from this point on, God has showed who is going to have life when there's no source except for him. The only body who can make a dead rod that has not been connected to a tree blossom and bloom and bring forth fruit is somebody who has the power of resurrection. So when people stand before God and say, I served Mohammed, or I served Buddha, or I served whoever, he's going to say, show me their rod. Their rod, it has no life. You served a dead religion. The only faith that has life in it is the faith that is given by God. Nobody but God could make that rod do that. And they all knew it had to be now the power behind the throne that was demonstrated in something dead. If you want to work and do something great for God, come before him as a dead rod. And say, Lord, without you, I can't be resurrected, I can't bloom, I can't blossom, I can't bring forth seed. Now, there's a lot of people pretending that they're blooming and blossoming and bringing forth nuts. That's because they are nuts. I don't want to be nuts. I want to be a seed. Okay, and this is why that the position of leadership that it was has to be, because the tent of meeting has a meaning. This is where the first ideal came from. God gave me inspiration about the tent revival in 2012. I was reading about the tent of meeting, and God said, you need to go outside the structure of what you got going on here and have a tent meeting. And we did, and it was very successful. We had 3 in a row, and a lot of ministries. There's pastors that came out of that. There was evangelists came out of that. There was we baptized as many as 60, and one of the tent revivals. So we saw God sprout, bring forth life, and he budded something that was dead because there was no connection to religion in it at all. We even went outside of what we used as a structure and just went in a tent. And it just removed everything of the authority of man, and we were totally dependent upon the Lord. So this is what brings forth life, okay? Because life has to come out of death. And this is why when Jesus, to establish lordship, had to die. Because he had to be resurrected to show that his seed that come forth, he sprouted, bloomed, and brought forth seed. So immediately when he came out of the ground, he brought forth other people. See, and nobody talks about when Jesus rose from the dead, many came out of the ground. Okay? Now, have you ever thought about who they were? I'll tell you who one of them was. It was Joseph. Because Jesus said, Abraham saw my day and rejoiced in it. Abraham saw the resurrection. He understood the budding of the rod. He understood that Jesus had to die and he had to be risen from the dead. So what he did was he shared it with his sons and his grandsons. If you can get you to be buried at a certain spot in Jerusalem, when the Lord springs forth in resurrection, you'll get to be in the first fruits. So Joseph got a hold of it, and Joseph said, listen, I'm not going to make it to Jerusalem, but you have to promise me that you'll take my bones to Jerusalem. So I believe that Joseph's bones was buried where Jesus was resurrected, and Joseph was one of them that came out of the ground and became the first fruits and went back into heaven. He understood a prophetic word that would hold the power of all of heaven. See, when you understand that authority, why else would he want his bones to be buried in Jerusalem? It don't even make sense. I've asked seasoned ministers this question. Why did Jesus have to die on Golgotha? What was the prophetic meaning of that? And why was it called the hill of the skull? The skull. The skull, not skulls. There was one skull. Does anybody know whose skull was buried there? Goliath. It tells you in the Bible. Whenever David cut off Goliath's head, he took the head and buried it in Jerusalem. And it became the hill of Golgotha, the skull of the giant. So when Jesus was crucified, they took him up on the hill of Golgotha and they crucified him, and his blood ran down his body off his hill onto the head, fulfilling Genesis where it says, his head shall be crushed and your heel bruised. His blood dripped down on that head and broke the curse of sin. See how many truths are just hidden, inside of what God's trying to show us. So my point being is out of death. This is why this church focuses on, a lot of times people out of prison, people out of addictions, because, man, you find somebody who knows they're dead and you get resurrection life in them, they start bringing forth fruit. And I've shared this, that, some of our best Thai players have come out of addiction class. Now, figure that one out. Because once you're dead and you know you're dead and God resurrects you to life, your fruit belongs to him. But see, foolish people get proud. They get a pride about them. That they think it's got something to do with them, because, they're blind. They're blind to the fact that the more humble you are, the more dead you are to God. So his resurrection power will bring you to life. Once you start taking pride in your talent or your gifting or whatever, then you're stopping the resurrection power from flowing through you. That's powerful, man. But it's true, Because, the problems we're having today is people are dependent on ministry on education. I'm not against education, but it don't give you no resurrection power wherever you went to college. It don't give you resurrection power how fluent you can speak. I can have resurrection power and can't pronounce words right. Because that's what it is. Because, the thing about, we're all being ridden by the Lord. I'm just a donkey. And I'm never going to look back at the Lord and say, "Is the praises for me?" I mean, think about that. How foolish would a donkey be to realize it's just being ridden by the Lord who's being glorified? And when God gives me revelation or knowledge or power, like when the woman, was healed of blindness, and we've seen some other miracles, I'm like, they ain't got nothing. This is why the apostles said it has nothing to do with us. They tried to explain to them it is the power of that resurrection power. So here we can see that, God's power of manifestation of lordship in creation is revealed through resurrection. Now let me say that again, because one of the things I told you that I'd talk about in this section is the manifestation of lordship. The manifestation of lordship is through resurrection. Jesus did not become the Lord of glory until he was resurrected. That's why, where was that one scripture at that I had you go to earlier about the 1 Corinthians 4:8, is that it? About where had the princes of this world. Let's go back and revisit that because I want you to see something here. Had the princes of this world knew, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Why did it call him Lord of glory there? Because there was a new glory. I don't know, Scott, where I got it wrote down here somewhere, I'm sure. Do you know where it is? Anybody where it was at? 1 Corinthians, was it 4:8 or 2:8? Okay, 1 Corinthians 2:8. Thank you. Let's go back to that because see, this is important because here we're seeing Jesus receive his identity as Lord of glory. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you go to Revelations, we don't have time to do this today, but look, which none of the princes, we know princes are, I explained to you, are of the demonic kingdom. They don't have a king. That's why there's lawlessness. And if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So what was the crucifixion? How did the crucifixion make him the Lord of glory? Because it took death to bring forth resurrection power. So when you die to self, you're raised in power. But people refuse to die to self. They want to be glorified in self, and they want to be the one who's glory. So the Lord of glory means that his lordship has a different glory than the glory that was in heaven before. So not only, see, this does two things, okay? He's not going back to be the same Lord he was when he left heaven. He emptied himself of what he was and become a being, created being, okay? Even though he was half man, half God, if you want to look at it that way, he still walked in the flesh. This flesh had to go through the process of suffering to learn obedience, and it had to go through death to receive the resurrection power. So once it received the resurrection power, it was stated with a new kind of glory that's never been in heaven. Now, one thing that these princes realized is that what they worship in heaven, he gave up, and the new glory that the new Lord of glory he is, they don't qualify. So there's no redemption for the devil. And he's in. There's not even a chance they could be reinstated because they were created for the other glory. Now that's insane, ain't it? But let's see, was that 2 Corinthians 4:7? Okay. Okay, go to 2 Corinthians 4:7. For some reason I got that wrote down and I don't even know why. So, okay. Oh, here it is. Paul. See, Paul, I mentioned this earlier, he recognizes all of a sudden now that what treasure that he has. What treasure is he talking about here? He's talking about the treasure of resurrection power. He's talking about a treasure that has been given. But notice what Paul says. It says we have this treasure in earthen vessels. Now watch this. You're going to understand something here, because you were given the Lord of glory resurrection power in an earthly vessel. Why? That the excellency of the power, the excellency of the authority may be in God and not of you. How can you stand up and say, look at me, what God has done through me, whenever you have a treasure in an earthly vessel, just to prove that the excellency of the authority can be done in an earthen vessel? So the minute you give all about I, you're reducing the excellency of his resurrection power. And that's why I believe the church is so powerless today, is because we've exalted ourselves. And that's why people who are looking for truth, they're not interested. Well, we can get that down at the courthouse. And what happens is we just become foolish. Now you understand when the rod became alive and it required a dead, dried rod, you can understand now is that when the scripture says that which is the flesh is flesh. Can't have resurrection life in living flesh. But the minute you die to yourself, you are now capable of carrying the resurrection power. So now we got to understand something here, that what God is trying to do is he's trying to get you out of the way while you're yet living. See, you can be dead while you're yet living. And that's why Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead. Because when we learn true humility, we come to understand that only God can make the rod sprout. It takes power of heaven and authority of heaven to make something that was dead to live. And the only way these dead churches are ever going to have any life is it comes from God and not some strategy of man. So from that point on, they knew who was to be the priest, high priest. How? Because that Aaron's rod sprouted. And he confessed of himself that it was not of his own doing. But now watch this. The same thing that happened to Aaron happened to these ministers I was talking about. Does anybody know how Aaron died? I'm going to tell you. This is a lesson to you. Okay? They were on the journey of the wilderness. There was a way called the way. And scholars have studied this road called the way that would have took them probably less than 18 months to complete their journey. But when they went down the way, they come to a city called Edom. Okay? Now watch this. What was the pattern of priesthood? Why did you have a high priest? Okay? Why did God establish priesthood? Why did he establish lordship? Well, because in the priesthood, the priest held the power and the authority of God. So when they come to the city of Edom, what did Moses do? He said, send 2 guys down there and ask them if we can pass through. What? Total ignorance. I'm sorry. I mean, I respect Moses, but him and Aaron missed it. Because the Edomites were the children of... And Esau was, what color was his hair? Red. What does Edom mean in Hebrew? Red. The red children. The red-haired children. It was the whole city of that tribe was there. Moses knew they hated him because he was the descendant of Isaac. So he's like, go down there and try to... See, what he should have done is he should have told Aaron, Aaron, you're the high priest. You were chosen of God by resurrection life. You go down there and tell them we're passing through. If not, you're going to release the authority of God on them. But instead of using the priesthood, they used 2 guys who went down and tried to negotiate. Well, they said, and it's right in the scripture, you tell that Moses, he comes down here, we'll kill him. So what do? They go through the mountains. We're just going to go around them. We'll go up on the hill and go around them. Anybody know what happened up on the hill? That's where the 70,000 got snake bit. And Moses had to do an alternative. He had to make now instead of following the priesthood, he has to make a brazen pole. And he has to make a snake upon the pole, and whoever looks upon the snake could be healed to stop the judgment of not doing it right. See, even today people are confused about the brazen snake on a pole. I've had people try to tell me, well, that's what's on the ambulances when it goes by. No, it ain't. That's the snake of Diane of the city of Athens. She was a goddess who had a snake room, and she would take you in there and lay you and let the snakes crawl on you, and you get healed. That's where that snake come from. I researched it. It didn't come from Moses making the pole. Moses had to make the brazen serpent out of brass because brass is judgment. So when he hung it on a pole and everybody looked at the judgment of Satan, in the end it broke the curse of his bite. Because when Jesus would be put on a pole, it would judge Satan's works. Now, okay, now watch this. So now they violated the priesthood order. They've had to make an alternative to get healing. What is the next thing that happens after 70,000, I think it was, died, and they make the brass serpent? And what is the next thing recorded in the Bible? Moses takes Aaron up on the hill, and he takes off his priestly garment, and he drops dead. Now think about that. Disobedience in the priesthood denied the resurrection power of lordship. They had to put it on a pole to be redeemed because they were reaching into the future. And now God says, I have no need for a priest like this. Take him up on the hill. This is his own brother. And he took off his garment and he drops dead. So I'm going to tell you, Ananias and Sapphira was a seed sown into the church for what's coming in the latter days. You mark my words. There are preachers going to drop dead because when they keep violating God's authority, he's going to strip their garment off of them of their calling, and you watch what happens. There's going to be church after church after church. Oh, there'll be plenty of churches open here for long, but they ain't nobody going to take the position because they're going to fear. It's going to bring back the authority of the resurrection power. Because God says, I've had enough. So I want them to know that my power comes from resurrection power. But see, here's what men are doing today. They're taking their iron rod and they're trying to rule with the rod and not the resurrection power. And that's why you can't get up under a man who's authoritative in his own self. Because he's got the rod, he's got the position, but it has no resurrection power. Don't get up under that. Because if you do, you're going to pay the same price he does. See, these people are making rods very attractive today. We're skillful in, carving our rods and polishing them, and, but they got no power. When's the church going to wake up and say what we want is power? When we want power. So, what if God calls us now for us all to bring our rods back to the tent of meeting and let's see who God chose? I'm telling you, we're living in a time when we cross that threshold into that next 1,000 years, everything's going to change. And I believe we are in the threshold. The problem is we don't know how long the threshold is. When you walk out that door, that threshold is about 4 inches. So stepping over it is a very quick process. But in the Bible, the flood took, 80 years. Okay? The transition from the Old to New Testament took hundreds of years. We don't know. The transition of Saul to David took 17 years. So we're seeing that the transitions that are taking place are different variables in the Bible. So we don't know. This threshold could take, 10, 20, 30 years. I don't think it will. I believe we've already closed out the 6,000, if you want to know the truth about it. But God hasn't released everything until we step into the threshold. Because Hosea said in the third day he will revive us. The true sign that we're looking for right now in the earth is the release of the harvest in the last days. And God cannot bring the harvest until he has men who knows how to walk in resurrection authority. And resurrection authority can't come until we get the revelation of lordship. Until Jesus Christ becomes your Lord, you'll never hold resurrection power. Sorry. Now I'll close with giving you another example. When God gave Sarah and Abraham a promise of a child, and they messed up and, got the handmaiden and end up with Ishmael. How many Ishmaels we got in the church today? Whenever when we was going to build the building, God spoke to me and said how to do it. Somebody came to me and said, hey, we could raise some money. Us ladies can have a bake sale. And I didn't even mean to say this, but it just come out of my mouth. I said, we don't want no Ishmael bake sale. I mean, your ideals are appreciated and your work is, but God's going to build a house. See, he's going to build the house out of resurrection power. So this is what he had to show. He had to show Abraham and Sarah, he had to teach them something, okay? So he literally had to wait till Sarah's womb was dead. Why? Because he brought a baby out of death. He raised a seed out of death, just like he did the seed on the rod. So there was no question to Sarah, even though when she heard the prophecy, she laughed. She laughed. How could I have a baby? My womb's been dead. I ain't had a period in a long time. And you look at this man.
Well, just look at him.
You think, we ain't even attracted to each other anymore. But God said, now listen. God said, I've been waiting on your womb and his seed to become dead so that when I bring this child forth, there's no question as to who brought him. And what he's trying to do right now is he's bringing us as a church into a place where there's no question that it's God who did it. There's no question. So, got a question? It did. I know, and see that like we started in September of 19, and some money came in, and we actually started the foundation in March of 2020. Have over 50% of the church. We was operating on 47% of the church. The rest of them left. So people come to me and said, well, are we still going to build the building? I'm saying, absolutely. See, if you understand resurrection power, God had to have something die before he could raise life out of it. And boy, here come the money. It just came. And I'm thinking, should have killed half of this a long time ago. But the point is, God wanted us to see that it had to be him who built the building. Now, there's not a doctor, a lawyer, or a big business owner in here, so there was no big fat checks of $100,000, $200,000, or $500,000 written to us. This was all nickel and dime money, if you want to call it that. But I'm telling you, it came for directions that it was crazy because we were in a state of death. But guess what? When I stood in that parking lot and I said, you do not have the authority, God said, now I've got the death. I've got a man who understands authority. I'm going to raise up a life. Okay, who's got a question? Do what?